2009, Volkswagen factory, South Africa. Thousands of people have shown up to say goodbye. Not to a person, but to a car. A car that gave an oppressed nation a true taste of freedom. A car so infamous that it terrorizes the South African streets even today. Mzanis Miata, or formerly known as the Mk1 Golf. A car that entered production in Europe in the mid-80s was still selling in 2009 to just one country. So why? Why did Volkswagen SA keep making this Golf for over 25 years, and why did thousands of people show up to say goodbye? Well, in this video, we're going to find out just that. Why did the Mk1 Golf become South Africa's unofficial national car? To understand what the Golf meant to South Africa, we got to understand what South Africa looked like before the Golf was even a thing. This was the mid-1900s South Africa. This was the apartheid era. You were either white or non-white, and non-white South Africans were pushed far out of city centers, far enough to where they were quote-unquote out of the way for white South Africans. And this became a problem, and also became a weapon. You see, transport was a weapon of control back in the apartheid era. Millions of South Africans would wake up before dawn, walk tens of kilometers to a station, either a bus station or a train station, pay for that public transport to come all the way into the city, work a full day's wage for a system that barely paid them enough to survive, and then reverse the journey home all the way back again. This wasn't a problem of comfort, it was a problem of dignity and cost. You see, public transport for non-white South Africans exists just because it had to, and they were owned by the apartheid companies themselves. Public transport was such a problem in South Africa that even the late great Nelson Mandela himself started his journey right here over a transport dispute. The bus fare between Alexandra Township and Johannesburg City had gone up by 1 penny. Just 1 penny. And thousands of South Africans walked tens of kilometers every day to work and back in protest. One of these people was a law clerk by the name of Nelson Mandela. He would go on later to write about how it felt to actually take action. In a way, I've departed from my role as an observer and become a participant, as to march with one's people was exhilarating and exciting. His first ever stand was for transport. So how do you sell a car to a country where transport is a weapon of control? Now, don't get me wrong, it wasn't illegal to buy a car. It was just very hard to own one. And there were also laws in place to where you could and couldn't be. If you had a car and you simply just drove through the wrong area, you could get arrested. But somehow, not only VW, but many manufacturers managed to set up plants in South Africa. Volkswagen, BMW, Ford, Chevrolet, they all managed to build and sell cars locally. But how? See, at the time, Volkswagen SA was busy building the Beetle locally, and they were getting success as the Beetle was the people's car of the world. However, when it became time to replace the Beetle, VW SA would turn to Germany, and Germany, well, they were already working on a replacement for the Beetle. They turned to a man named Giuseppe Giugiaro for help. So you may know the name. Giuseppe Giugiaro started Ital Design in 1968. He's also the man responsible for the Ferrari 250 GT, DMC DeLorean, Lotus Esprit S1, and I can go on about the host of Alphas he's designed as well. He was tasked with a simple creation. He needed to make a front-wheel drive, front-engined, water-cooled replacement for the Beetle. And what he came up with was the Mk1 Golf. His clean folded paper design wouldn't only go on to define the Golf for generations to come, but hatchbacks entirely. The Mk1 Golf came with a 1.3 liter and a 1.6 liter petrol engine. The 1.6 inline-4 made just 81 kilowatts, but did 0 to 100 km an hour in just under 10 seconds, which was fast enough to drive in the streets and also fuel efficient enough in the midst of a global oil crisis. I mean, Giugiaro curated something that looked good, it drove good, and it was affordable. So VW SA would see what Giugiaro had designed and ultimately bring the Mk1 Golf over to South Africa. And they did just that. They managed to create the car where 80% of its parts were built locally. So it was an actual affordable option for the South Africans who could actually get their hands on one. However, this was the 1970s, and 1970s South Africa wasn't very nice of a place to be in. See, this was the most violent decade in South Africa's history, giving way to the Soweto bus riots. Yes, the most violent riots in South Africa's history over transport disputes. I mean, it was so bad that the South African government was shooting students in the streets in cold blood. Yeah, yet Volkswagen would go on to release the Golf in 1978, just 2 years after all of this. And somehow they managed to sell it. Between 1978 to 1984, they sold 155,000 units locally. That's insane. That's still in an oppressed nation. That's still where a nation is controlled by transport. And there's also other manufacturers out there creating cars locally, selling it to us. See, many white South Africans at the time who could afford it or had the option to credit had one. Township businessmen and teachers and doctors as well, if they could build a business or a proper career, which people did in the apartheid time, they could do it. They also bought one. The Mk1 Golf somehow broke through all of this and became such a success that when it became time to replace it with the Mark II, VWSA had a very, very big problem. See, the Mark II was safer, it was more comfortable, it was also bigger. So much bigger, in fact, that it became known as the Jumbo Golf. This all made it a lot more expensive, with a lot more parts having to be imported from Germany. So now Volkswagen is staring at a gap in the market, with two options ultimately. Option A, bring the Polo in from Asian markets and start a brand from scratch. Or option B, do something that nobody has ever done before, and that's sell an old model right next to the new one. And they did just that. In 1985, they will go on to almost release the Econo Golf. Yes, this was, think beige on beige. It was the most stripped down version of a Golf possible. Thankfully, somebody at VW's marketing team killed that idea. Because what we got instead was a car for the youth. And with a new youthful look, Volkswagen needed a new youthful name. Something that stood out, something that was attractive, something that felt special. Thus, the City Golf was born. It debuted in 1985 in three colors: red, yellow, blue. It had white wheels, white bumpers, and city stickers along the side. It also had a 1.3 liter straight out of the original Golf that was set up to feel more alive. Throw in a 4-speed manual box, and you have the perfect 5-door option for the youth of South Africa. And it sold. It sold so well that just in 1 year, people were asking for more and more options. VW, being the people's car that they are, they decided to give us more options. But they did it in the form of a wet dream instead. It was the City Sport in 1986. The City Sport had a 1.6 liter engine with a 5-speed close ratio box, meant it was the first City Golf to actually rip through the streets. See, between 1986 and 1993, just a year before South Africa's biggest changes, Volkswagen released a few more options to satisfy the people. We would get a new facelift with new bumpers, new grills, wheels, interiors. We also got a new City Shuttle, which was the more econo-focused Golf. We also got the legendary CTI during this time. The CTI was a true homage to the Mk1 Golf. It had a 1.8 liter engine that was fuel injected. It had a 5-speed box straight from the Mark II GTS itself. It hits 180 kilometers an hour. With only 375 CTIs ever sold, it was an absolute icon. But unfortunately, VW couldn't keep producing it because of the emissions regulations were starting to change at the time. So just a year into making it the CTI, they had to scrap it. And with that comes 1994. South Africa will see the biggest changes that they were waiting for: freedom. And this really did change everything. I mean, there were millions of South Africans who were locked out of the economy for generations who now had buying power. Don't get me wrong, it wasn't instant, but the country was slowly beginning to change. We were becoming one, and gates were now open. VW would see democracy, but they wouldn't really plan for what was about to happen. See, because in 1995, VW released a City Golf variant that would go on to become the best-selling Mk1 version ever, the Chico. Now, remember, this isn't just a democracy thing. VW didn't see democracy and be like, we need to offer a new car. VW was going through some changes with the City Golf because the City Golf was out for a very long time at this point. It was out for 11 years on top of the original 8-year run of the original City Golf designed in the early 70s. Because we needed a refresh more than ever before, and boy did Volkswagen give us one. The Chico came with a 1.3 liter when launched as a replacement to the Shuttle, the more economic version of the City. And with more and more South Africans gaining access to the economy, they were all asking the same question: what car do I buy? And sitting there in the forecourt, where it had always been for almost 2 decades, was an entry-level car that looked good, performed good, was light on fuel, cheap to buy, cheap to maintain, and when launched at the time, sold again almost 27,000 units, making it the most successful City Golf ever. After this, VW knew they were genuinely onto something. They had a true people's car replacement from the Beetle, a car in a nation that just couldn't get enough of it. I mean, at this point, the Volkswagen City Golf made up of 49% market share. 49% market share in the entry-level segment. Do you know how wild that is? Because you have so many manufacturers in South Africa building and selling cars for this segment, yet 1 in every 2 people had a Golf. VW will go on to improve the Golf over the next few years. You have a country where each year more and more people have buying power and more people want the taste of what a car gives them: freedom. And the City Golf kept being the car that Volkswagen always said it was going to be: the people's car. The early 2000s saw fuel injection as standard, Lupo dashboards, Lupo steering wheel, and a host of upgrades like an MP3 player, factory immobilizer. Things locals would install after buying a Golf were slowly becoming factory options, all while complying with 21st century emissions regulations. At the peak of the City Golf, it wasn't selling next to the Mark II, it wasn't selling next to the Mark III, it wasn't even selling next to the Mark IV. At its peak, the City Golf, the Mk1 City Golf, was selling brand new in the same showroom right next to the 5th gen Golfs. That is absolutely wild. The early 2000s, the Golf was not just becoming a part of South African car culture, but it now defines South African car culture. It won the hearts of not only a first-time car buyer, but every enthusiast who loved cars. Before its end of production in 2008, we would see one more truly special model, and that came in the form of the 1.8R. In 2007 to 2008, 100 1.8Rs were made. The R line came with a 5-speed manual and a fuel-injected 1.8-liter engine. It only made 90 kilowatts, and it doesn't sound like a lot of power, but it became the fastest Mark 1 Golf ever. It hits almost 200 kilometers an hour in a family hatchback. And it only sold about 100 models, making one of the most desirable city Golfs next to the CTI. And with that comes 2009, the limited run. So the last 1,000 Golfs roll out the production line were all limited edition Golfs. They had to end it, not because I think they wanted to, but because they were forced to. Emissions at the time and the car being so old as it is, it didn't make sense to really modify it anymore. So eventually Volkswagen will go on to drop the City Golf entirely and replace it with the Polo. However, the Mark 1 Golf, including the city variant, it didn't sell because VW told us to buy it. It didn't sell because it was the only option available. It wasn't even some executive decision to sell the Mark 1 Golf and keep selling it until democracy arrived. It sold because VW released the right car at the right time, at the right price, to the right people. That is it. It did exactly what VW said it would do and become the people's car. It became and still is Mzanis Miata. Whether you want a first car, a student car, a fuel saver, a track beast, or a street demon, Mark 1 is always the answer. So the next time you're cruising down a South African street, feeling good about what you're driving, remember this: you may be fast, but there's always a Mark 1 that's faster.